The old adage of investing when there is blood on the floor is rolled out in hundreds of investment and management guides each year. While instinctively and managers know they should be investing in marketing, research and development and good skills, but with so many trying to manage for the short term, they battle to find a realistic balance. We've got Gavin Symanowitz from feedbackrocket.com. He's been looking at this for the last 2 weeks in Finweek, and he thinks he might have some pointers for management to consider. We're also joined still by Garth Theunissen from Finweek, and we've also got Mannie Hirsch from Mannie Hirsch, CEO of Gestalt, joining us there. Thank you so much for joining us today. So Gavin, you've written this story about, I suppose, too much focus on the bottom line could be detrimental further down the line. You need to focus on the top line.
Yeah, exactly. There's a lot of pressure on CEOs, especially in a tight environment, to control costs, to maintain profitability. And there's two levers really that they can play with. They can either play with increasing revenues or reducing costs. And unfortunately, because of the short-term pressure of the market, there's this constant focus on quarterly results and what's actually happening in the very short term. They tend to go with the second option, which is reducing costs, which does bring up the profit or maintain the profitability in the short term, but can have quite negative consequences in the longer term.
Let's run through some of those areas, research and development. Mannie, what are your thoughts on the impact that cutting back on that will have for companies, specifically, of course, in the areas where there's new product innovation continually coming into the market?
I think it's very sectoral based, number one. Number two is I don't believe it's an either-or situation. I think at all points in time, we have a changing environment in some areas, enormous changes are happening. So I think what's very important from a company's point of view is you need to understand what the market need is at all points in time. Obviously, once you're looking and saying, hang on, is my client base being reduced? I'm reducing revenue. Why? What? You need to relook at that and understand how your costs fit into that and what can be cut and what can't be cut. So I think that at all points in time, you need to be looking to say, what are the new market opportunities that the market is bringing? I think that's critical. But I think if I just expand, if I extrapolate on that and say everybody's now going to maintain my costs, the market is dropping, but I'm going to increase my marketing costs, no company gets anywhere. So you need to re-look at that situation at all points in time, particularly when your revenues are dropping.
What are your thoughts on this, Mark?
Yeah, there's quite a cool quote here I found on Harvard, basically saying great leaders know that how they fight a war often decides whether they win the peace or not. And I think that's quite it's very apt for it. We feel like you're in a war at the moment. There's no good times, there's no fat. Everything just seems to be this constant struggle. And I think, media, for instance, one of those industries where we've been cut to the bone. Guys are working longer, harder. And one of the things that I get, and you can see it anecdotally, people are working almost too hard and not, they're really literally thinking, how do I get through the day, the week, the month? They're not really thinking, well, what's my opportunity for innovation?
They're not thinking creatively because they just don't have the capacity.
All you're doing is surviving, and I think that again, media is a fantastic example. Print media is a fantastic example because everyone's so busy trying to say, well, here's how big my pool is. We know it's getting smaller. We know we're facing these outside challenges, but we don't spend enough time stepping out of that circle and trying to say, well, how do we innovate for 2-3 years down the line? But Gavin, you and I have talked about it a little bit from an industry perspective. But it's one of those challenges you do see at the moment. You seem to people are struggling. They're managing for the here and now and not thinking about long-term investment.
Exactly, and especially things like R&D and innovation. It's not like it's something you can just switch on and off at will. Very often, especially with research-intensive organizations, is that it takes years down the line in order to bring products to market. To make sure that you're meeting a market need. And if you switch off the funding, then often you destroy a whole year's worth of effort that's gone into it. And again, you can't just switch it on again. So it means that there's now a time delay until you can start bringing new products and services out to market again. And that can be quite destructive.
I also, I know I'm not a businessman, but putting my cynical journalist hat on, I think one of the things that I've noticed is to be blunt, any idiot can manage the bottom line. I think it does take a special type of person to try and control the bottom line while growing the top line. But one thing I have seen is if a company focuses too much on cost reduction in the bad times, the people that are left behind, it destroys their morale, and they invariably start looking a way out.
A better place to work, a better environment.
Or a plan B in case they get an envelope on their desk asking them to leave. And I just think that sometimes that consideration isn't taken into account, the impact that has on the morale of the workforce. And it's not even a couple of years down the line where you could suffer. It's quite immediate where you can suffer.
I remember, I think it was Johan Rupert from Richemont, always goes on about, it's not about these quarterly numbers that we want to deliver to the market. It's a long-term plan we have here. And if they aren't as good as you hoped in this quarter, it's because it's about the longer-term strategy. So, of course, reiterating the fact that shareholders are very focused on, first half profits, full year profits, as opposed to like the broader scheme. What's your thoughts on that, Mannie?
I think that the market need is the critical element always, and obviously business is about people first and about money secondly. So I buy in a limited extent the anecdotal stuff there. It obviously happens. We've had the bank suddenly reducing numbers in great quantities. And this has obviously got a huge effect on the rest of the staff. But it's short term. The key becomes, yes, as a company, you need to say, where am I going to be tomorrow? Where am I going to be next year? Where am I going to be in 5 years' time? And you need to really look and say, what are the market needs and how can I satisfy those? But I don't believe that you do one or the other. You've got to look and say, there's a change in the situation. For example, let's assume that you've got an organization which is customer based. You definitely don't look at saying, I must reduce the service to my customers, the article said. I think that's the last thing you look at, because what you've got to do is say, how do I keep my customers? Therefore, you may have to put more money into service of customers and upgrading your product. But the critical element then becomes, how do I handle my people to grow my market and retain my customers while I look at where can I get new customers.
And I suppose it's about, outdoing your peers to some degree during a time like this. It's about what other competitors are doing and
Absolutely.
seeing if you can kind of come out on top at the end of it.
Yeah, I think that there's actually a double impact on the people, because not only do they see the carnage that's happening around them in the company as the costs come down or uncontrolled, but generally one of the budgets that gets cuts the quickest is the HR training budget. So it means that the people themselves actually suffer because they don't get the developmental and the skills learning that they actually need for their own development. So they disengage, and also you need those skills in order to move yourself out of the recession, because very often you need to invest in the people in order to move forward. So those people start looking elsewhere, and generally it's the better people that start looking elsewhere because they're the ones who have the options. So what tends to happen is the better people leave, the more talented people leave, the weaker people stay, and it actually just exacerbates the situation entirely.
Do you guys think that, in South Africa we have this trend where CEOs tend to be accountants? I've got nothing against accountants, some of my best mates are accountants, but do you think that when the bad times hit, their first default action is, let's cut the bottom line? Instead of
that trend is international, by the way, not just in South Africa. Yeah.
Okay. What the cutting the bottom line or the CA?
No, both of them. But CEOs tend to be accountants.
And is that necessarily a detrimental thing or bad thing during times of recession or sluggish growth, that the immediate kind of knee-jerk reaction is to look at the bottom line?
It's not a knee-jerk reaction. The CEO is responsible to his shareholders. Shareholders come to meeting and say, where's my money? So obviously the CEO's function is to say, how do I grow the profits of my company? How do I protect my shareholders? And accountants do that very well.
Okay, maybe I want to check something, but then is a CEO necessarily accountable to his shareholder? And you would use the example of Telkom, for instance, at the moment. I think there we've got an external shareholder putting a lot of pressure on it. But the comment that comes out of the new CEO's office is essentially, I want to own my business. I can't be dictated to by a shareholder the whole time. And the shareholder wants the short-term return. Very few of them are in for the long term. I mean, how do you balance how do you push back against a party that wants to manage you to a budget?
I think if you look at any shareholders agreement, you'll find that the shareholders elect the board, and therefore the board is accountable to the shareholders. I don't know of any business where that isn't the case.
Yeah,
so I can stand up as a CEO and shout as much as I want to. When the shareholders get together, they can say thank you very much, goodbye.
But surely it's also the duty of the shareholder, of the CEO, to inform the shareholder that the plan that they're asking for might not necessarily have the best outcome.
The shareholders don't ask for the plan. That's what the board does. The board says, shareholders, that's how we're going to run the company. That's what you're going to get. Now, as a shareholder, I can make a decision which says, hang on, I don't like that, and I can give you an input, which is what about this, what about that, and what about the other.
Which is what I mean. If shareholders are screaming for job cuts, and even if your board is agreeing with them and saying, let's do it, surely as a responsible CEO, if you truly believe it's not necessarily the best action to implement first, you're duty bound to inform them of that.
Absolutely.
So there we go. The
100%
mark,
correct.
I suppose here, the mark of a good CEO is to be able to sell the vision to the shareholders and explain the long-term vision and hope that they stand by you. And I suppose it's their choice whether they do or they don't.
And in general, I think you'll find that the shareholders will stand by you.
Yeah, I mean, the danger, of course, is that if you, that visionary CEO, and you've got, you're investing in all these things that everyone else is cutting back on, in the short term, your numbers are going to look terrible because not only are you feeling squeezed because of the recession, but also you're actually spending more than your competitors in all the different areas. And, the shareholders are going to look at your company and look at your competitors and say, well, what's this guy doing wrong? Your cost-to-income ratio is out of whack with all your competitors. This other company actually looks a little bit more attractive.
You're not paying us a dividend.
Not paying dividends, etc. And you're right. If you're not the CEO who can say, look, the reason I'm doing this is because of this long-term vision that I've got and it's going to pay dividends in 3 or 4 years' time, just be patient with me, then, that's the skill and that's the key.